I never thought my reputation as the unit coward would be what saved 37 innocent lives. But sometimes the very thing that makes people dismiss you becomes the reason. You're the only one who can do what needs to be done. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and for 8 months in the disputed territories of northern Slovakia, everyone in the 82nd Humanitarian Relief Battalion knew me as the medic who froze under fire. The label stuck after an incident in March when insurgent mortars started falling near our field hospital, and I spent 20 minutes crouched behind a supply crate instead of rushing out to treat wounded civilians like the other medics did. What nobody knew, what I couldn't explain without sounding like I was making excuses, was that I hadn't frozen from fear that day. I had been listening. Growing up in the mining towns of Colorado with my grandfather, who had spent 40 years defusing unexploded ordnance from old mining operations, had taught me something that no military medical training could provide. I could hear things in the rhythm of explosions, in the way debris settled, in the silence between impacts, that told me stories about what was happening underground. That day in March, while my colleagues saw my stillness as cowardice, I was processing the acoustic signatures of those mortar impacts and realizing that the insurgents weren't just attacking our position randomly. They were systematically targeting the ground in a pattern that suggested they were trying to activate something buried beneath the civilian settlement we were protecting. The field hospital sat on the outskirts of Zalomka, a farming village that had changed hands 4 times during the conflict. The area had been heavily mined by retreating forces, but official clearance teams had supposedly swept the immediate vicinity around our medical facilities 6 months earlier. Standard protocol required us to stay within the cleared perimeter, marked by white posts that formed a rough rectangle around our tents and supply areas. Beyond those markers lay uncertain territory where unexploded devices could still be active, waiting for the wrong footstep or the right vibration to detonate. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb commanded our relief battalion with the rigid efficiency of someone who had spent his entire career in logistics and procurement rather than combat operations. Webb appreciated medics who followed procedures, who stayed within designated safe zones, and who prioritized speed over caution when treating casualties. My tendency to pause and assess situations before moving, to listen for sounds that others couldn't hear, to question whether the quickest route was necessarily the safest route, had quickly marked me as unreliable in his assessment. The other medics in my unit were genuinely brave people who had volunteered for humanitarian service in an active conflict zone because they wanted to save lives under dangerous conditions. Sergeant First Class Jennifer Chun had earned a Bronze Star for evacuating wounded soldiers under direct fire during her previous deployment. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had joined our unit after completing 3 tours with Special Operations medical teams. Captain Sarah Mitchell, our Chief Medical Officer, had been recommended for humanitarian relief work based on her exceptional performance during disaster response operations in earthquake zones and refugee camps. These were people whose courage was proven and recognized, whose instincts under pressure had saved lives in situations where hesitation could mean death. When they saw me taking extra time to evaluate situations, asking questions about ground stability and acoustic conditions, before moving into areas where civilians needed immediate medical attention, they interpreted my caution as fear. The reputation, built gradually through small incidents where my careful approach appeared to contradict the urgent medical response that emergency situations demanded. During a civilian casualty incident in April, I had insisted on taking a longer route to reach wounded villagers because the direct path crossed ground that sounded wrong when I listened to the way our footsteps resonated. The delay cost us precious minutes, and one of the civilians died before we could provide adequate medical intervention. My colleagues saw this as a clear example of how my excessive caution could have fatal consequences, while I remained convinced that the direct route would have triggered explosive devices that could have killed our entire medical team along with the people we were trying to save. The acoustic sensitivity that I had developed through years of accompanying my grandfather on mine clearance operations was difficult to explain to people who had never experienced it. The ability to distinguish between solid ground and areas where subsurface cavities or buried objects created different resonance patterns when disturbed by footsteps or equipment required a combination of trained hearing and intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught through standard military instruction. My grandfather had called it listening to the Earth's secrets, and had emphasized that the skill was only useful if you had the patience to pay attention to subtle signs that most people would dismiss as irrelevant background noise. Military medical training focused on rapid response techniques designed to save lives in combat situations where speed was often more important than perfect safety protocols. The assumption was that medics would operate in environments where immediate threats were known and visible, where the primary danger came from enemy action rather than hidden hazards that required specialized detection methods. My approach to evaluating terrain and listening for subsurface anomalies before proceeding with medical evacuations contradicted the aggressive response mentality that had been drilled into my colleagues during their combat medical training. The cultural divide between my methodical approach and the unit's expectations for rapid response created friction during daily operations and training exercises. Other medics began requesting different partners for patrol duties and casualty evacuation missions, preferring to work with colleagues who shared their commitment to speed over caution. The requests were always made through official channels with professionally appropriate justifications, but the cumulative effect was to isolate me from the collaborative relationships that were essential for effective medical team operations. Captain Mitchell attempted to address my perceived performance issues through additional training sessions focused on rapid decision-making under pressure and techniques for managing fear responses during combat medical operations. The training was well-intentioned and professionally delivered, but it was designed to solve problems that didn't accurately describe my actual challenges with unit integration. I couldn't explain that my hesitation wasn't based on fear of enemy action, but on recognition of environmental hazards that my colleagues weren't trained to detect without seeming to claim superior knowledge or criticize their competence. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's assessment of my performance reflected the broader institutional preference for medics who demonstrated clear courage under fire through rapid response to emergency situations. During my quarterly evaluation, he noted that while my medical skills were technically proficient, my tendency toward excessive caution and apparent reluctance to enter dangerous areas to treat casualties raised questions about my suitability for humanitarian relief operations in active conflict zones. The evaluation recommended additional courage-building training and closer supervision during high-risk medical missions. The recommendation for closer supervision effectively meant that I would be assigned to less critical medical duties where my perceived limitations wouldn't compromise mission effectiveness or endanger other personnel. Instead of serving as a primary medic for civilian casualty response, I was reassigned to routine medical care within the secure perimeter of our field hospital, treating minor injuries and illnesses that didn't require venturing into potentially dangerous areas where explosive devices might still be active. The reassignment was presented as an opportunity for me to develop confidence and demonstrate reliability in a controlled environment before returning to higher risk medical operations. But everyone in the unit understood that it represented effective demotion based on questionable performance under pressure. My colleagues were professional in their interactions with me, but the underlying message was clear. I had been identified as someone whose fear responses made her unsuitable for the kind of dangerous medical work that defined our mission unsuitable for the kind of dangerous medical work that defined our mission in which she Slovakia. Working within the secure perimeter gave me opportunities to observe the broader patterns of conflict activity around Zelonka village, and to develop a more comprehensive understanding of how the various military forces were positioning themselves in relation to the civilian population. The elevated position of our field hospital provided clear views of the surrounding agricultural areas where villagers continued to tend their crops despite the ongoing military activity, and where the geometric patterns of old minefields were sometimes visible as lines of disturbed earth or areas where vegetation grew differently due to subsurface metal contamination. From my position treating routine medical cases, I began documenting the acoustic patterns associated with different types of military activity in the region, using the specialized listening skills that my grandfather had taught me to identify the signatures of various explosive devices and underground disturbances. The work was unofficial and personal, conducted during off-duty hours when I could focus attention on the subtle environmental sounds that others dismissed as meaningless background noise, but it provided me with growing confidence that my unusual abilities might have practical value even if they weren't appreciated by my immediate superiors. The intelligence I was gathering suggested that the official mine clearance operations had been less thorough than reported, and that significant areas around our humanitarian operations remained contaminated with explosive devices that posed serious threats to both military personnel and civilian populations. The pattern analysis indicated that insurgent forces were deliberately using the presence of these devices as tactical advantages, positioning their operations to drive military responses into areas where hidden explosives could cause maximum casualties among both enemy forces and innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. By early June, my systematic observation of acoustic patterns and ground conditions had revealed what appeared to be a comprehensive network of buried explosive devices that extended far beyond the officially cleared areas where our humanitarian operations were supposed to be safe. The discovery represented exactly the kind of specialized intelligence that could save lives and prevent catastrophic incidents, but it also put me in the impossible position of trying to communicate complex technical findings to superiors who had already categorized me as an unreliable medic, whose opinions about tactical situations weren't worth serious consideration. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm in the second week of June, when the rain created perfect acoustic conditions for detecting subsurface anomalies across the entire valley surrounding Zelonka village. Lightning provided natural seismic pulses that revealed the underground structure of the area with startling clarity, and what I heard through my grandfather's teachings made my blood run cold. The network of buried explosives wasn't random placement by retreating forces or opportunistic mining by insurgents. Someone had systematically converted the entire agricultural zone into a precision-engineered killing field designed to maximize civilian casualties when activated. I spent that night documenting everything I could detect, using a combination of audio recording equipment from our medical supplies and detailed sketches that mapped the acoustic signatures across different sectors of the valley. The pattern that emerged showed interconnected clusters of devices arranged in geometric formations that would create overlapping blast zones covering virtually every path that civilians might use to evacuate from the village during an emergency. Whoever had designed this system understood both explosive engineering and human psychology well enough to predict exactly how panicked villagers would attempt to flee, and had positioned devices to intercept those escape routes with devastating effectiveness. The sophistication of the minefield suggested military-grade planning and professional installation that exceeded the capabilities of local insurgent groups. The spacing between devices, the depth of burial, and the integration with natural terrain features indicated foreign specialists had been involved in creating what amounted to a death trap for the entire civilian population of Zelonka. The technical competence required for such extensive underground installation would have taken months of careful work by experienced combat engineers who understood advanced explosive placement techniques. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My documentation included detailed acoustic maps showing the locations of what I estimated to be over 200 individual devices, ranging from anti-personnel mines designed to maim and terrorize to larger charges capable of destroying vehicles and buildings. The network was dormant but fully functional, waiting for the right trigger conditions to activate simultaneously across multiple zones. Based on the acoustic signatures, many of the devices appeared to be connected through underground cable systems that would allow coordinated detonation from a central command point. The implications terrified me more than any enemy fire I had experienced during my deployment. The 3,700 civilians living in Zelonka were unknowingly surrounded by a weapon system designed specifically to kill them en masse if they attempted to leave their homes during a crisis. The humanitarian relief operations we were conducting, the medical services we provided, the sense of security our presence created for the local population, all of it existed within a carefully constructed trap that could be sprung at any moment by whoever controlled the detonation mechanisms. I knew that presenting this information to Lieutenant Colonel Webb would require overcoming his established perception of me as an unreliable medic whose fears led to paranoid interpretations of routine situations. The complexity of what I had discovered demanded technical explanation that would sound incredible to someone without specialized knowledge of acoustic detection methods and underground explosive systems. My track record of excessive caution and apparent reluctance to operate in dangerous areas would work against me when trying to convince superiors that I had identified a threat of unprecedented scope and sophistication. My first attempt to communicate. My findings came during the weekly briefing on security conditions around our humanitarian operations. Webb conducted these sessions with clinical efficiency, reviewing intelligence reports from higher headquarters and coordination requirements with other military units operating in the region. The format allowed limited input from subordinate personnel, typically restricted to operational concerns directly related to medical mission requirements. When I requested permission to brief the command staff on potential explosive hazards in the surrounding area, Webb's initial response reflected his established assessment of my competence and reliability. He reminded me that mine clearance was the responsibility of specialized engineering units, and that medical personnel should focus on their assigned duties rather than attempting to duplicate the work of experts who were trained and equipped for explosive ordnance disposal. The official clearance reports indicated that all areas within our operational perimeter had been thoroughly swept and declared safe for humanitarian activities. I persisted in my request, explaining that I had detected acoustic anomalies that might indicate the presence of uncleared explosive devices in areas where civilians regularly traveled. Webb's patience with my concerns diminished rapidly as I attempted to describe the technical basis for my conclusions. He pointed out that I had no formal training in explosive detection, no specialized equipment for ground-penetrating analysis, and no authority to conduct independent assessment of terrain that had already been cleared by qualified personnel. The other officers present during the briefing exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared assessment that I was once again allowing fear-based thinking to create imaginary threats where none existed. Captain Mitchell attempted to support me by noting that medical personnel sometimes observed environmental conditions that might be relevant to operational safety, but her tone suggested professional courtesy rather than genuine belief in the validity of my concerns. Major Frank Davidson, our intelligence liaison with Regional Command, dismissed my acoustic detection claims by noting that such techniques required years of specialized training and expensive electronic equipment that wasn't available to medical units. The suggestion that I could identify buried explosive devices through casual, Observation contradicted established protocols for threat assessment and mine clearance operations. My persistence in raising these concerns despite clear guidance to focus on medical responsibilities was becoming a pattern that suggested underlying psychological issues that might require professional evaluation. The meeting concluded with Webb's direct order for me to discontinue any independent assessment of explosive hazards and to report suspected mine locations through proper channels if I genuinely believed I had observed something that warranted attention from qualified specialists. He emphasized that creating unnecessary alarm among civilian populations or undermining confidence in official clearance operations could have serious consequences for our humanitarian mission and for relationships with local authorities who were cooperating with our relief efforts. Over the following days, I watched village children playing in areas where my acoustic analysis had identified clusters of anti-personnel devices, and elderly farmers tending crops directly above what sounded like anti-tank mines capable of vaporizing anyone who triggered them. The casual normalcy of daily life in Zielonka was maintained only through ignorance of the lethal infrastructure that surrounded every home, every school, every gathering place where the community conducted its social and economic activities. The psychological strain of possessing knowledge that I couldn't effectively communicate to people who could act on it began affecting my ability to perform routine medical duties. My concentration suffered during patient consultations because I was constantly aware of the explosive devices positioned beneath the ground where my patients lived and worked. Sleep became impossible as I lay in my bunk listening to the acoustic signatures of the minefield and calculating casualty estimates for different emergency scenarios that might trigger mass civilian evacuation attempts. Staff Sergeant Torres approached me privately after noticing my deteriorating performance and offered what he intended as helpful guidance about managing stress reactions that were common among medical personnel serving in combat zones. He suggested that my focus on potential explosive threats might be a psychological defense mechanism designed to create controllable fears that distracted from the genuine unpredictability of enemy action. The conversation was conducted with genuine concern for my well-being, but it revealed how completely my colleagues had dismissed the technical validity of my explosive detection capabilities. Captain Mitchell recommended that I speak with the battalion chaplain about anxiety management techniques and requested that I undergo additional medical evaluation to determine whether combat stress was affecting my ability to function effectively in a humanitarian relief environment. The evaluation would be conducted by military mental health specialists who could assess whether my concerns about explosive hazards represented legitimate threat awareness or symptoms of psychological distress that required treatment. The mental health evaluation was scheduled for the following week, and I understood that the results would determine whether I remained with the unit or was evacuated for psychiatric treatment that would end my deployment and potentially my military career. The evaluation would focus on my decision-making processes, my interpretation of environmental threats, and my persistence in raising concerns that contradicted official assessments of operational safety. During the interim period before my evaluation, I continued monitoring the acoustic conditions around Zielonka village, while maintaining the appearance of focusing exclusively on medical duties within our secure perimeter. The ongoing analysis revealed troubling changes in the minefield's electronic signatures that suggested someone was conducting maintenance or modification activities on the buried devices. The changes were subtle but consistent with preparation for activation, as if the system was being readied for operational use after months of dormancy. The intelligence I was gathering indicated that the minefield represented more than a defensive measure or area denial weapon. The positioning and connectivity suggested that it was designed for a specific tactical purpose that would require precise timing and coordination with other military operations. Someone was planning to use the civilian population of Zielonka as bait in a larger strategic operation, allowing humanitarian relief activities to continue until the optimal moment for triggering mass casualties that would serve broader military or political objectives. My attempts to document these observations through official intelligence channels were blocked by Major Davidson, who informed me that medical personnel were not authorized to conduct independent threat assessment activities and that my continued focus on explosive hazards was creating administrative complications that interfered with legitimate intelligence operations. He recommended that I restrict my observations to medical conditions and leave security assessments to personnel who were trained and authorized for such responsibilities. The isolation from my colleagues became more pronounced as word spread that I was undergoing mental health evaluation for persistent anxiety about imaginary explosive threats. Other medical personnel began avoiding casual conversation with me and requested different duty assignments to minimize their association with someone whose psychological stability was under official review. The professional distancing was conducted with courtesy, but it effectively eliminated my access to informal communication networks that might have provided alternative channels for sharing my intelligence about the minefield. My grandfather had taught me that the most dangerous moment in explosive ordnance work came when you knew something was wrong, but couldn't convince others to take appropriate precautions. He had seen experienced miners killed by devices that multiple people had identified as dangerous, but that supervisors had declared safe, based on incomplete information or institutional pressure to maintain operations. The parallel to my current situation was exact. I possessed specialized knowledge about lethal hazards that threatened innocent lives, but institutional mechanisms prevented that knowledge from reaching people who could act on it. The mental health evaluation would either validate my concerns and provide credibility for my explosive detection claims, or it would diagnose me with anxiety disorders that would permanently discredit my intelligence about the minefield. Either outcome would determine whether the 3,700 civilians in Zielonka village would receive warning about the death trap that surrounded their community, or whether they would continue their daily lives unaware that their survival depended on the restraint of whoever controlled the detonation systems buried beneath their feet. The mental health evaluation was scheduled for Thursday morning, but Wednesday night changed everything. At 2,347 hours, insurgent forces launched a coordinated attack on the government outpost 15 kilometers south of Zielonka village, using the assault as cover for electronic activation of the minefield that had been dormant beneath the civilian settlement for months. I heard the activation sequence through my monitoring equipment, a series of low-frequency pulses that armed the interconnected explosive network and established remote detonation capability from a command position somewhere in the surrounding hills. The attack on the government outpost was designed to trigger a predictable military response that would drive civilians from Zielonka village directly into the killing zones where hundreds of armed mines now waited for the slightest disturbance. Government forces would pursue the insurgent attackers through the valley, using the village as a staging area and inadvertently herding the civilian population into evacuation routes that had been systematically mined with precision-placed devices, capable of creating cascading explosions across multiple escape corridors. I realized that I had less than 6 hours before dawn brought military operations that would transform Zielonka into a massacre site where 3,700 innocent people would die because I had failed to convince anyone with authority that the threat was real. The mental health evaluation scheduled for the morning would be irrelevant if the minefield activated before I could somehow warn the villagers or neutralize the devices that surrounded their community. My options were limited by military regulations that prohibited unauthorized departure from our secure perimeter, and by the complete absence of support from superiors who had categorized my explosive detection claims as symptoms of psychological instability. Attempting to evacuate civilians through official channels would require convincing Lieutenant Colonel Webb that my acoustic intelligence was accurate, A conversation that would consume precious time while achieving nothing except confirmation that I was experiencing combat stress reactions that required immediate psychiatric intervention. The alternative was to leave our secure area without authorization, enter the active minefield that I had been monitoring for weeks, and attempt to guide civilian evacuations through safe corridors that existed only in my acoustic maps derived from months of careful observation. The plan violated every protocol for medical personnel operating in combat zones, guaranteed court-martial proceedings if I survived, and depended entirely on abilities that no one else believed I possessed. Standing alone in the middle of the road that everyone believed was safe, I used my medical entrenching tool to probe the ground surface until I located the first anti-personnel mine buried 18 inches beneath the packed earth. The device was exactly where my acoustic maps had indicated, positioned to maximize casualties among evacuating families, while creating panic that would drive survivors into adjacent areas where additional explosives waited to complete the killing sequence. The explosion when I deliberately triggered the device with my entrenching tool created a crater 6 feet across and sent shrapnel fragments into the trees surrounding the road, providing undeniable proof that the official evacuation route was heavily mined and that my acoustic detection methods had been accurate. The demonstration stopped the civilian evacuation immediately while confirming that my months of careful observation had identified a genuine threat that could have killed hundreds of innocent people. Captain Morrison's immediate response was to arrest me for reckless endangerment and destruction of property, but the discovery of additional explosive devices during the subsequent emergency engineering sweep validated every element of my intelligence about the minefield's scope and sophistication. Military explosive ordnance specialists confirmed that over 200 devices had been recently activated and that the entire civilian evacuation would have triggered coordinated detonations across multiple kill zones. The engineering assessment revealed that my acoustic detection methods had achieved accuracy levels that exceeded electronic ground-penetrating radar systems, identifying device locations with precision that enabled safe civilian passage through corridors that conventional mine detection equipment had failed to recognize. The technical competence I had demonstrated contradicted every assumption about my capabilities and reliability that had shaped institutional assessments of my performance and psychological stability. Lieutenant Colonel Webb personally conducted the after-action review that examined how a medical officer with no formal explosive ordnance training had identified and neutralized a sophisticated minefield that had been invisible to qualified specialists using standard detection equipment. The review concluded that my specialized acoustic abilities represented unique capabilities that had prevented mass civilian casualties through methods that no other personnel in the theater of operations could have replicated. The 37 families I had evacuated through hand-guided passage represented only a small fraction of the lives saved when my demonstration prevented the main evacuation from proceeding into the kill zone. But they became the foundation for developing new mine detection protocols that incorporated acoustic analysis techniques based on my grandfather's teachings and my practical application of those skills in active combat conditions. My court-martial for unauthorized departure from assigned duties was dismissed when higher headquarters classified my actions as exceptional performance under combat conditions that had prevented a humanitarian catastrophe. The classification included recognition that my acoustic detection capabilities represented specialized expertise that should be developed and applied to military operations rather than suppressed through conventional disciplinary procedures that failed to recognize unconventional but effective threat detection methods. The mental health evaluation that had been scheduled to determine my fitness for continued military service was replaced with specialized training assignments that would allow me to teach acoustic mine detection techniques to explosive ordnance specialists and combat engineers who could benefit from methods that supplemented electronic detection systems with human sensory capabilities that my grandfather's mining experience had taught me to develop and trust. 6 months later, I stood before a joint session of NATO explosive ordnance specialists at the International Mine Action Conference, presenting the acoustic detection protocols that had been developed from my experience in Zelonka village. The audience included military engineers from 12 nations who were implementing similar techniques in mine-affected regions throughout Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where conventional detection methods had proven inadequate for identifying sophisticated devices installed by adversaries who understood how to exploit the limitations of electronic detection systems. The techniques I had learned from my grandfather, refined through months of careful observation in Slovakia, and validated through successful civilian evacuations under combat conditions, had become standard training for military personnel operating in environments where buried explosive hazards threaten both military operations and civilian populations. My transformation from dismissed coward to recognized expert had created protocols that would save lives in conflicts where acoustic intelligence could detect threats that remained invisible to conventional military technology. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 years after Zelonka, delivered through diplomatic channels from the Republic of Slovakia's newly established government. Inside was a photograph of a small monument erected in the village square, bearing the names of 3,700 civilians, whose lives had been preserved through what the inscription called the courage of one who listened when others could. Not here. Below the monument's dedication, children played safely on ground that had once been engineered for mass destruction, their laughter echoing across fields where families now harvested crops without fear of triggering buried death. The transformation from vilified medic to internationally recognized expert had occurred gradually as military organizations worldwide began implementing acoustic detection protocols, derived from techniques my grandfather had taught me in the mining towns of Colorado. What had been dismissed as fearful hesitation by my original unit had become the foundation for advanced training programs that equipped explosive ordnance specialists with sensory capabilities that electronic equipment couldn't replicate. The same cautious approach that had earned me the reputation as a coward had proven essential for safely navigating environments where conventional detection methods failed to identify sophisticated threats. Major General Patricia Hayes, who now directed the Army's Counter-Improvised Explosive Device Task Force, had personally overseen the development of training curricula that incorporated my acoustic analysis techniques into standard explosive ordnance education for military personnel deploying to mine-affected regions. The programs emphasized patient observation and environmental awareness as essential complements to technological detection systems, validating the methodical approach that had once been interpreted as evidence of psychological instability unsuited for combat operations. The International Committee of the Red Cross had invited me to establish humanitarian mine action protocols that civilian relief organizations could use in post-conflict environments where military explosive ordnance teams weren't available for comprehensive clearance operations. The work involved training civilian volunteers in basic acoustic detection principles that could help them identify dangerous areas while conducting refugee assistance and medical relief activities in regions where buried explosive devices posed ongoing threats to displaced populations. During my assignment with the humanitarian training program, I worked with village elders in Cambodia who possessed traditional knowledge about ground conditions and environmental sounds that complemented the technical skills my grandfather had taught me. Their understanding of how monsoon rains affected subsurface acoustic patterns, combined with my experience detecting electronic signatures from armed explosive devices, created hybrid detection methods that were more effective than either approach. Used independently, the collaborative development of detection techniques with local experts challenged conventional assumptions about who possessed relevant expertise for identifying explosive hazards in post-conflict environments. Village farmers who had lived with the threat of buried mines for decades often understood terrain characteristics and seasonal variations that formal military training didn't address, but their knowledge had been systematically overlooked by international clearance organizations that prioritized technological solutions over indigenous expertise. The success of community-based detection programs led to invitations from the United Nations Mine Action Service to develop protocols for training local populations in areas where professional clearance teams couldn't provide comprehensive coverage due to resource limitations or ongoing security concerns. The approach recognized that sustainable mine action required building local capabilities rather than depending exclusively on external technical assistance that might not be available when communities needed to make immediate decisions about ground safety. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who had once questioned my reliability during medical operations in Slovakia, contacted me through official channels to request acoustic detection training for his current assignment with a special operations medical unit deployed to Somalia. The region contained extensive networks of improvised explosive devices that conventional detection equipment couldn't reliably identify, and his unit had suffered casualties attempting to provide medical support in areas where buried threats remained undetected by standard clearance procedures. The irony of training personnel who had previously dismissed my capabilities wasn't lost on me, but Torres approached the instruction with genuine respect for expertise that his combat experience had taught him to value regardless of its source. His willingness to learn techniques that contradicted his previous assumptions about effective threat detection demonstrated the kind of intellectual humility that was essential for operating safely in environments where overconfidence could be fatal. The training I provided to Torres and his team emphasized the importance of challenging institutional assumptions about who possessed relevant knowledge and what methods were appropriate for different operational environments. Military doctrine that prioritized speed and technological solutions often overlooked human capabilities that could provide critical intelligence about environmental hazards, but effective threat detection required integration of multiple approaches rather than dependence on single methodologies. Captain Sarah Mitchell, who had recommended me for mental health evaluation during the Zelonka deployment, was now serving as Chief Medical Officer for a NATO training facility where acoustic detection protocols had become mandatory instruction for all personnel assigned to mine-affected regions. Her evolution from skeptic to advocate reflected broader institutional recognition that unconventional but effective techniques deserved serious consideration regardless of their departure from established procedures. The facility that Mitchell supervised included a realistic training environment where students could practice acoustic detection under controlled conditions that simulated the challenges of identifying buried explosive devices in complex terrain. The curriculum incorporated lessons learned from my experience in Slovakia, along with techniques developed through collaboration with traditional experts from mine-affected communities worldwide, creating comprehensive training that prepared military personnel for operational environments where technological detection systems might be inadequate. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, whose dismissal of my concerns had nearly resulted in mass civilian casualties at Zelonka, had requested transfer to administrative duties after acknowledging that his command decisions during the Minefield crisis reflected insufficient understanding of specialized threat detection capabilities that weren't addressed in conventional military training. His voluntary removal from operational command demonstrated the kind of institutional accountability that was necessary for preventing similar failures of leadership judgment. The organizational changes that followed the Zelonka incident included establishment of formal channels for personnel to report unconventional intelligence without facing career consequences for challenging established assessments. The procedures recognized that effective security required contributions from individuals who possessed specialized knowledge that might contradict conventional wisdom. but whose insights could be essential for identifying threats that standard detection methods missed. My current position as Director of Applied Acoustic Intelligence for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency provided authority to coordinate detection protocols across multiple military services while developing training programs that prepared personnel for environments where buried explosive hazards required specialized identification techniques. The work involved collaboration with university researchers who were studying the scientific principles underlying acoustic detection methods, validating through laboratory analysis the techniques that my grandfather had taught me through practical experience in mining operations. The research confirmed that human auditory capabilities could detect subsurface anomalies with precision that exceeded electronic ground-penetrating systems under certain environmental conditions, particularly when operators possessed trained hearing and systematic analysis skills that enabled them to distinguish between natural acoustic patterns and signatures created by buried artificial objects. The scientific validation provided credibility for training programs that incorporated acoustic detection as a standard complement to technological survey methods. The annual Humanitarian Mine Action Conference that convened in Geneva included presentations from community representatives who had implemented acoustic detection training in their regions, demonstrating the practical effectiveness of techniques that bridged traditional knowledge and technical expertise. Village representatives from Afghanistan, Cambodia, and Colombia described how local detection capabilities had enabled their communities to reclaim agricultural land and conduct daily activities with reduced risk of triggering buried explosive devices. The conference presentations emphasized that sustainable mine action required recognizing and developing local expertise rather than imposing external technical solutions that communities couldn't maintain independently. The most effective clearance programs combined professional explosive ordnance capabilities with community-based detection skills that enabled ongoing safety assessment as environmental conditions changed and new threats emerged. My keynote address to the conference focused on the importance of institutional humility in recognizing unconventional expertise and the dangers of dismissing capabilities that didn't conform to established assumptions about appropriate qualifications or methods. The Zalonka experience had demonstrated that life-saving knowledge could exist in unexpected places, but only organizations that maintained openness to diverse perspectives could benefit from expertise that challenged conventional approaches to threat detection. The audience included military officers, humanitarian relief workers, and community representatives from 43 countries where buried explosive hazards continued to threaten civilian populations years or decades after the conclusion of armed conflicts. Many participants shared experiences similar to mine, where specialized knowledge had been initially dismissed by institutional authorities, who later recognized the value of unconventional but effective approaches to complex security challenges. The establishment of the Acoustic Detection Fellowship Program provided funding for personnel from mine-affected regions to receive advanced training in detection techniques that could be adapted to their specific environmental and operational requirements. The program recognized that effective threat detection required understanding local conditions and cultural factors that influenced how communities interacted with potentially dangerous terrain, knowledge that couldn't be acquired through standardized technical training alone. Fellows in the program included former military personnel who possessed relevant acoustic skills, community leaders who understood traditional environmental knowledge, and technical specialists who could bridge scientific principles with practical application requirements. The collaborative approach produced detection capabilities that were more robust and sustainable than methods that depended exclusively on external expertise or technological solutions. The memorial service held annually in Zalonka village brought together representatives from the 37 families whose lives had been saved through acoustic detection of the minefield that had surrounded their community. The ceremony included Children who had been born after the crisis, growing up in safety that existed because one person had trusted unconventional knowledge and accepted personal risks to protect people she had never met. The village monument bore an inscription that my grandfather would have appreciated. Truth is heard by those who listen carefully, even when others choose not to believe. The words captured the essence of what he had taught me about paying attention to environmental signals that revealed hidden dangers, and about the responsibility that came with possessing knowledge that could save lives if applied correctly and courageously. Standing in the village square where children played safely on ground that had once been engineered for mass destruction, I understood that my transformation from dismissed coward to recognized expert represented something larger than personal vindication. It demonstrated that institutional assumptions about expertise and authority could be challenged successfully when human lives were at stake, and that the courage to trust unconventional knowledge could create changes that protected innocent people from threats that conventional approaches failed to recognize. The quiet victory that began with patient listening in a basement field hospital had rippled outward to create training programs, policy changes, and detection capabilities that continued to save lives in conflicts around the world. Sometimes, the most important battles were won not through dramatic confrontation, but through persistent application of specialized knowledge that others had dismissed as irrelevant or impossible. Part 5. 10 years had passed since that thunderstorm night in Slovakia, when I first heard the electronic heartbeat of a reactivated minefield, but I still woke sometimes at 0347 hours with the phantom sound of arming sequences echoing in my memory. The nightmares had evolved over the decade from pure terror to something more complex, a mixture of pride and haunting awareness that my ability to hear death buried in the earth had become both my greatest asset and my heaviest burden. Every detection success brought with it the knowledge of what would have happened if I hadn't been there, if I hadn't trusted the lessons my grandfather had whispered to me in Colorado mining tunnels when I was 12 years old. The headquarters of the International Acoustic Detection Institute occupied a converted monastery in Switzerland, its ancient stone walls now housing the most advanced acoustic analysis laboratories in the world. The irony of medieval architecture sheltering cutting-edge technology that detected modern threats wasn't lost on me as I walked through corridors where monks had once contemplated spiritual mysteries, and where I now contemplated the earthly mystery of how sound could reveal invisible dangers that threatened innocent lives across the globe. My office overlooked the training grounds where students from 47 nations practiced techniques that had evolved far beyond my grandfather's, intuitive mining methods into sophisticated protocols that combined traditional knowledge with advanced scientific understanding. The curriculum now included acoustic engineers from MIT, traditional healers from indigenous communities who understood environmental listening, former military explosive ordnance specialists, and civilian volunteers who wanted to help their communities navigate post-conflict landscapes where buried death still claimed lives decades after wars had officially ended. The morning briefing included reports from field teams operating in 12 countries where acoustic detection programs had been established through partnerships with local governments and international humanitarian organizations. Each report contained statistics that represented real lives, families who could now farm fields that had been abandoned due to mine contamination, children who could walk to school through territories that had been inaccessible for years, communities that had reclaimed economic opportunities in regions where the threat of buried explosives had prevented normal development. Dr. Sarah Kimura, MY deputy director and a former seismologist who had joined the institute after her earthquake detection expertise proved applicable to identifying subsurface explosive devices, briefed me on the latest technological developments that enhanced human acoustic capabilities without replacing them. The new equipment could amplify subtle ground vibrations and filter background noise, but it still required trained human interpretation to distinguish between natural geological features and artificial threats that created similar acoustic signatures. The technological enhancements represented a philosophical victory for approaches that valued human expertise rather than attempting to replace it with purely automated systems. Early in my career, military organizations had consistently favored electronic detection equipment over human sensory capabilities, assuming that technological solutions were inherently more reliable than individual skills that couldn't be easily standardized or replicated. The success of acoustic detection programs had demonstrated that the most effective threat identification required combining technological tools with human interpretation skills that machines couldn't duplicate. The partnership with Stanford University's Applied Physics Department had produced research that validated the scientific principles underlying acoustic detection, while revealing additional applications that my grandfather's practical experience hadn't explored. Laboratory studies confirmed that trained human hearing could detect ground resonance patterns with sensitivity that exceeded electronic sensors under specific environmental conditions, particularly when atmospheric pressure, soil moisture, and ambient noise levels created optimal acoustic transmission properties. The research had practical implications for expanding acoustic detection beyond buried explosive devices to other subsurface threats that posed risks to civilian populations. Unstable mining operations, buried chemical contamination, and underground structural failures all created acoustic signatures that could be detected through similar techniques, providing communities with early warning capabilities for environmental hazards that conventional monitoring systems often missed until problems became critical. My monthly consultation with the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations included coordination of acoustic detection support for missions in regions where peacekeeping forces operated in environments contaminated with various types of explosive remnants from previous conflicts. The consultation process had evolved from informal technical advice to formal integration of acoustic assessment into mission planning, reflecting institutional recognition that specialized detection capabilities could prevent casualties among peacekeeping personnel while improving their ability to provide security for civilian populations. Commander Lisa Park, who directed explosive ordnance operations for UN peacekeeping missions, had become one of the strongest advocates for acoustic detection training after witnessing its effectiveness during a crisis in Central African Republic, where conventional clearance teams had been unable to identify improvised explosive devices that were preventing humanitarian aid delivery to isolated communities. The acoustic assessment had revealed device locations that enabled safe passage for relief convoys, demonstrating practical value that couldn't be achieved through standard detection methods alone. The success in Central African Republic had led to requests for acoustic detection support from peacekeeping missions in 7 additional countries, creating demand that exceeded the Institute's current training capacity. I gathered my medical supplies and the acoustic detection equipment I had been using for unofficial intelligence gathering, along with colored smoke grenades from our emergency supply locker that could be used to mark safe passages through the minefield for evacuating civilians. The equipment fit into a standard medical evacuation pack that wouldn't attract attention if anyone observed me preparing for what appeared to be routine casualty response duties. The perimeter guards were focused on the distant sound of combat from the government outpost and didn't question my departure when I explained that I was conducting early morning medical checks in the village as part of preventive health services for elderly residents who couldn't travel to our field hospital. The explanation was plausible enough to avoid detailed scrutiny, and my reputation as an overly cautious medic who avoided dangerous situations supported the assumption that I was conducting routine medical activities in the safest possible environment. Zalonka village was already showing signs of agitation as news of the nearby combat spread through the community. Families were gathering their essential possessions and discussing evacuation plans that would take them directly into the areas where I had detected the highest concentrations of explosive devices. Children were being prepared for rapid departure, elderly residents were being assisted with mobility preparations, and livestock were being organized for movement through corridors that had been specifically mined to maximize casualties during emergency evacuations. My grandfather had taught me that the only way to safely traverse a complex minefield was to move slowly, test each step carefully, and trust your acoustic instincts about ground conditions that indicated the presence of buried devices. Speed and panic were fatal in environments where explosive ordnance had been professionally installed, because the placement patterns were designed to exploit the natural human tendency to seek the fastest route to safety. I began at the eastern edge of the village, where my acoustic maps indicated a narrow corridor between mine clusters that could potentially allow small groups of civilians to reach genuinely safe territory beyond the kill zone. The first steps into the unmarked minefield required absolute concentration on the subtle acoustic feedback that indicated solid ground versus areas where subsurface cavities or buried metal created different resonance patterns. Each footstep produced information about the composition and stability of the ground ahead, and my trained hearing could distinguish between the sounds of natural earth and the distinctive acoustic signatures created by buried explosive devices. The technique required patience and perfect attention to environmental feedback, qualities that had been interpreted as excessive caution and fear-based hesitation by my military colleagues. Moving through the minefield at the deliberate pace necessary for safe passage meant accepting that I could only guide limited numbers of civilians to safety before military operations brought chaos that would make acoustic detection impossible. The colored smoke grenades would mark the safe corridor I was creating, but only if I could successfully traverse the entire route without triggering devices that would kill me and eliminate any possibility of civilian evacuation. The first family I encountered was the Petrovics, elderly farmers who had lived in Zalunka for 60 years and who were preparing to evacuate using the main road that led directly through the most heavily mined section of the valley. Convincing them to abandon their planned route and follow a strange American medic through unmarked terrain required credibility that my reputation as a fearful soldier had undermined. But the distant sounds of approaching combat provided urgency that overcame their skepticism about my unconventional evacuation plan. Guiding the Petrovics through the minefield required constant communication about foot placement, movement speed, and response to my hand signals that indicated safe and dangerous areas based on acoustic feedback that only I could interpret. The elderly couple moved with the careful precision of people who understood that their survival depended on trusting expertise they couldn't comprehend, following my instructions exactly while maintaining the disciplined silence necessary for acoustic detection of buried threats. The successful evacuation of the first family proved that my acoustic maps were accurate and that civilian movement through the minefield was possible with proper guidance and extreme caution. The colored smoke grenade I deployed marked the beginning of a safe corridor that other villagers could follow, but only if they possessed the discipline to move slowly and follow precise instructions, rather than succumbing to panic that would drive them into the kill zones. Over the following 3 hours, I guided 17 families through the minefield using acoustic detection techniques that allowed us to navigate between explosive devices with margins of safety measured in centimeters. Each successful evacuation increased my confidence in the accuracy of my underground maps while demonstrating that the specialized skills my grandfather had taught me could save lives in situations where conventional military training was inadequate. The evacuation process was interrupted when government forces arrived in Zalunka and began implementing standard procedures for civilian protection that involved concentrating the population in central gathering areas before moving them through what they assumed were cleared evacuation routes. The military commanders had no knowledge of the minefield reactivation and were unconsciously implementing exactly the civilian management strategies that the insurgent mine placement had been designed to exploit. I attempted to warn Captain Lisa Morrison, the government liaison officer coordinating civilian evacuations, about the explosive hazards in the official evacuation routes, but my explanations about acoustic detection and minefield mapping were dismissed as panic-induced fantasies from a medical officer who had no training or authority in explosive ordnance assessment. Morrison emphasized that qualified engineers had cleared all evacuation routes and that unauthorized personnel should not interfere with established emergency procedures. The government evacuation began at 0630 hours with approximately 800 civilians being directed toward the main road that my acoustic analysis had identified as the most heavily mined section of the entire kill zone. I realized that I had minutes to either convince Morrison that the official route was deadly or to take direct action that would prevent the massacre that was about to occur when hundreds of families stepped onto ground that had been systematically prepared for mass casualty events. My decision was instantaneous and irreversible. I ran directly into the path of the civilian evacuation, positioning myself in the center of the main road, where my presence would force the evacuation to halt while I demonstrated the presence of explosive devices that threatened every person attempting to use the official route. The action violated every protocol for military medical personnel and guaranteed immediate arrest for interfering with emergency operations. But it was the only way to prevent hundreds of deaths that would occur within minutes if the evacuation continued. The adaptations had led to hybrid approaches that combined rapid technological assessment with selective acoustic verification in situations where initial detection results were ambiguous or potentially unreliable. The festival celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Zalunka minefield discovery brought together survivors, international dignitaries, and acoustic detection practitioners from around the world in a celebration that honored both the lives saved and the institutional changes that had emerged from a crisis that could have resulted in mass casualties. The village had been transformed from an isolated agricultural community into a symbol of how individual courage and specialized knowledge could create changes that protected innocent people from hidden threats. The memorial ceremony included presentations by village children who had grown up in safety that existed because of acoustic detection capabilities that had prevented their parents and grandparents from walking into carefully prepared killing zones. Their presentations included artistic interpretations of what it meant to live without fear of the ground beneath their feet, powerful reminders of why acoustic detection work mattered beyond technical achievements or professional recognition. The children's choir performed traditional songs that had been adapted to include verses about listening carefully and trusting knowledge that came from unexpected sources. The musical tributes captured themes that resonated beyond the specific historical event, celebrating the broader human capacity to overcome institutional limitations and individual fears in service of protecting others from harm that might remain invisible until it was too late to prevent. The presentation of the International Humanitarian Service Award recognized not just my individual contribution to acoustic detection, but the collaborative efforts of everyone who had supported the development and implementation of training programs that continued to save lives in conflicts around the world. The award acknowledged that sustainable impact required building institutional capabilities, rather than depending on individual expertise that couldn't be transferred or replicated effectively. The acceptance ceremony provided an opportunity to recognize my grandfather's influence on everything that had followed from his patient teaching in Colorado, mining tunnels where he had shared knowledge that most people considered obsolete or irrelevant to modern threats. His understanding that the Earth revealed its secrets to those who listened carefully had become the foundation for technologies and training programs that protected people in conflicts he could never have imagined. The personal letter from the President of Slovakia, expressing national gratitude for preventing what intelligence assessments had confirmed would have been the largest civilian casualty event in the country's modern history, provided official recognition that individual actions could have strategic impact when they prevented tragedies that would have influenced regional stability and international relations. The prevention of mass casualties had contributed to successful peace negotiations that might not have been possible if the Minefield activation had succeeded in creating the humanitarian crisis that insurgent forces had planned. The comprehensive damage assessment conducted by international investigators had revealed that the Zalonka minefield represented only one component of a broader campaign designed to discredit government forces and international humanitarian organizations through mass civilian casualties that would have been attributed to inadequate security measures. The prevention of the massacre had disrupted strategic plans that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, demonstrating how local acoustic detection had influenced regional security dynamics. The intelligence gathered through acoustic analysis of the minefield's electronic systems had provided investigators with technical evidence that led to identification of foreign support networks that had supplied advanced explosive devices and installation expertise to insurgent forces. The technical intelligence had contributed to broader counter-terrorism efforts that disrupted similar operations in multiple countries, multiplying the strategic impact of what had begun as individual detection of unusual acoustic patterns. My current assignment as Special Advisor for Unconventional Threat Detection to the Secretary General of the United Nations provided opportunities to influence policy development for humanitarian operations in environments where conventional security assessment methods were inadequate for identifying sophisticated threats that exploited gaps in standard detection capabilities. The position enabled me to advocate for institutional recognition of specialized expertise that existed outside traditional qualification frameworks. The policy development work involved collaboration with representatives from government agencies, military organizations, humanitarian groups, and academic institutions who were grappling with evolving threat environments where adversaries specifically designed attacks to circumvent conventional security measures. The collaborative approach reflected recognition that effective threat detection required diverse perspectives and capabilities that couldn't be provided by any single organization or methodology. The annual report to the UN Security Council on unconventional threat trends included analysis of how acoustic detection and similar specialized capabilities could enhance security for humanitarian operations, while providing early warning of threats that might escalate into larger conflicts, if not identified and addressed promptly. The report emphasized that prevention through enhanced detection was more effective and less costly than response to incidents that had already occurred. The briefing to Security Council members included demonstrations of acoustic detection techniques and presentations by practitioners who had implemented training programs in their respective countries. The demonstrations provided concrete examples of capabilities that complemented traditional security measures while revealing threats that might remain invisible to conventional assessment methods until they materialized into actual attacks on humanitarian personnel or civilian populations. The establishment of the Elena Rodriguez Fellowship for Unconventional Threat Detection created funding for personnel from developing countries to receive advanced training in acoustic detection and related specialized capabilities that could enhance security in post-conflict environments. The fellowship program recognized that sustainable threat detection required building local expertise rather than depending on external technical assistance that might not be available when communities faced immediate security challenges. Fellowship recipients included former military personnel who possessed relevant technical background, community leaders who understood local environmental conditions and cultural factors that influenced threat assessment, and young professionals who could develop careers in humanitarian security while contributing to their communities. Long-term safety and development. The diversity of participants ensured that training programs remained relevant to diverse operational contexts and cultural environments. The research collaboration with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Laboratory had produced innovative applications of acoustic detection principles to urban environments where buried infrastructure, electronic interference, and ambient noise created challenges that hadn't existed in the rural agricultural settings where the techniques had been originally developed. The urban applications required adapting traditional methods while developing new approaches for complex acoustic environments. The urban research had practical implications for post-conflict reconstruction efforts in cities where explosive devices might be hidden in buildings, underground utilities, or transportation infrastructure that was essential for economic recovery and normal civilian life. The techniques could also be applied to earthquake damage assessment, structural engineering evaluation, and environmental monitoring in urban areas where subsurface conditions affected public safety and development planning. The publication of Listening to the Earth, a practical guide to acoustic threat detection, provided accessible instruction for communities and organizations that wanted to develop basic acoustic detection capabilities without requiring extensive technical training or expensive equipment. The book combines scientific explanation with practical exercises that readers could use to develop their own acoustic sensitivity while understanding the principles that made detection possible. The book had been translated into 23 languages and distributed through humanitarian organizations, educational institutions, and community development programs in regions where buried explosive hazards continued to threaten civilian populations. The widespread distribution reflected recognition that acoustic detection knowledge could benefit communities regardless of their economic resources or access to advanced technological solutions. The feedback from readers around the world confirmed that basic acoustic detection principles could be learned and applied effectively by people with diverse backgrounds and experience levels. The success stories included farmers who had used acoustic techniques to identify safe areas for agricultural development, teachers who had incorporated detection training into school safety programs, and community leaders who had established local detection capabilities that reduced dependence on external technical assistance. The documentary film, The Sound of Safety, chronicled the development of acoustic detection from my grandfather's mining expertise through its application in military and humanitarian context to its current status as an internationally recognized capability for threat detection and community protection. The film provided accessible explanation of technical concepts while highlighting human stories that demonstrated the practical impact of acoustic detection on individuals and communities worldwide. The film's premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival had generated significant media attention and public interest in acoustic detection as an example of how traditional knowledge could be adapted to address modern security challenges. The publicity had led to increased funding for training programs and research initiatives while raising awareness about the continuing threat that buried explosive devices pose to while raising awareness about the continuing threat that buried explosive devices pose to civilian populations in post-conflict environments. The educational outreach program that accompanied the film's distribution included classroom materials for teachers who wanted to incorporate acoustic detection concepts into science education, demonstrating how traditional environmental knowledge could complement technological approaches to understanding and interacting with natural systems. The educational materials emphasized that effective environmental monitoring required combining multiple approaches rather than depending exclusively on technological solutions. The establishment of acoustic detection training centers in 12 countries provided regional capabilities for preparing personnel to work in their local contexts while maintaining connections to international networks that supported ongoing professional development and technical innovation. The regional approach recognized that effective training required understanding local environmental conditions, cultural factors, and operational requirements that couldn't be addressed through centralized programs alone. The regional centers had developed specialized curricula that addressed unique challenges in their respective geographical areas while maintaining core competencies that enabled graduates to work effectively in diverse environments. The specialization included adaptation to different soil types, climate conditions, vegetation patterns, and cultural approaches to environmental knowledge that influenced how acoustic detection techniques could be implemented most effectively. The International Network of Acoustic Detection Practitioners maintained communication through annual conferences, professional journals, online collaboration platforms, and exchange programs that enabled sharing of innovations and lessons learned. Across different operational contexts, the network provided professional support for practitioners while facilitating ongoing development of techniques and applications that enhance the effectiveness of acoustic detection in diverse environments. Standing in my office overlooking the Swiss training grounds, where students from around the world practiced techniques that had saved thousands of lives, I reflected on the journey that had transformed me from a dismissed coward into someone whose grandfather's knowledge had influenced international security policy and humanitarian operations worldwide. The transformation hadn't been achieved through dramatic confrontation or sudden recognition, but through patient persistence in demonstrating that unconventional expertise could provide capabilities that conventional approaches couldn't replicate. The quiet revolution that began with careful listening in a basement field hospital had created ripple effects that continued to expand as new practitioners applied acoustic detection principles to threats and environments that I had never anticipated. Each success story represented validation of the principle that effective security required recognizing and developing diverse capabilities rather than assuming that technological solutions could address all threats equally well. The letters that arrived regularly from communities around the world, where acoustic detection programs had enabled people to reclaim land, rebuild infrastructure, and resume normal life, provided constant reminders of why the work mattered beyond professional achievement or personal vindication. The stories included children who could now play safely in areas that had been abandoned due to mine contamination, farmers who had expanded their agricultural operations into previously inaccessible fields, and families who had been able to return to homes that had been evacuated due to explosive hazards. The photograph on my desk showed 3 generations of the Petrovic family standing in the field where I had guided them through the minefield during that desperate night evacuation. From Zalonka village, the grandparents who had trusted my guidance when conventional evacuation routes would have led them to certain death, their children who had grown up to become successful farmers and business owners, and their grandchildren who had been born into safety that existed because one person had been willing to trust knowledge that others dismissed as irrelevant or impossible. The evening before the anniversary commemoration, I walked alone through the village of Zalonka, where acoustic detection had prevented mass civilian casualties while proving that individual expertise could challenge institutional assumptions when human lives were at stake. The fields where families now harvested crops showed no visible evidence of the sophisticated death trap that had once surrounded every home, every school, every gathering place where the community conducted its daily life. The silence that surrounded me was peaceful rather than ominous, filled with the natural sounds of rural life rather than the electronic signatures of armed, explosive devices waiting for victims. The transformation from hidden danger to genuine safety represented the ultimate validation of everything my grandfather had taught me about listening carefully to what the earth revealed to those who possessed the patience and knowledge to understand its secrets. The memorial service the next morning brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by acoustic detection work, from the families who had been evacuated through hand-guided passage during the crisis to international representatives who had implemented training programs in their own countries. The expansion required developing new educational programs that could prepare larger numbers of personnel while maintaining the quality and safety standards that were essential for operations where detection errors could be fatal. The challenge of scaling acoustic detection training while preserving its effectiveness had led to partnerships with military academies and civilian universities that could provide educational infrastructure for expanded programs. The collaborations required adapting training methods that had been developed for small groups of specialized personnel to formats that could accommodate larger classes while maintaining the intensive practice requirements that were essential for developing reliable acoustic interpretation skills. Colonel James Morrison, who had joined the Institute after completing his service as a military explosive ordnance specialist, supervised the development of standardized curricula that could be implemented at multiple training locations while ensuring consistent quality across different educational environments. His military background provided credibility with institutional partners who remained skeptical about unconventional training approaches, while his genuine enthusiasm for acoustic detection methods helped overcome resistance from personnel who preferred familiar technological solutions. The standardization process required careful balance between maintaining the flexibility that was essential for adapting acoustic techniques to different geographical and cultural contexts and providing sufficient structure to ensure that graduates possessed reliable capabilities for identifying threats in operational environments. The solution involved modular training components that could be combined differently depending on specific regional requirements, while maintaining core competencies that were necessary for safe and effective acoustic detection. The International Conference on Humanitarian Mine Action that convened annually in different host countries had evolved to include acoustic detection as a major focus area, reflecting the growing recognition that community-based detection capabilities were essential for sustainable clearance programs in post-conflict environments. The conference provided opportunities for sharing innovations and lessons learned while building professional networks that supported ongoing collaboration between acoustic detection specialists and traditional humanitarian organizations. This year's conference was hosted in Sarajevo, a city where the scars of conflict remained visible in bullet-marked buildings and where acoustic detection programs had helped communities reclaim parks and neighborhoods that had been abandoned due to mine contamination. The symbolism of conducting humanitarian discussions in a location that had experienced the full impact of modern warfare provided powerful context for presentations about detection techniques that could prevent similar suffering in current and future conflicts. My keynote presentation focused on the evolution of acoustic detection from a specialized individual skill to an institutionalized capability that could be implemented systematically across multiple organizations and operational environments. The transformation had required overcoming institutional resistance, developing training methods that could transfer tacit knowledge effectively, and creating support systems that enabled practitioners to maintain their skills while adapting to changing operational requirements. The audience included representatives from government agencies, military organizations, humanitarian relief groups, and academic institutions who were implementing acoustic detection programs in their respective spheres of responsibility. The diversity of participants reflected the broad applicability of techniques that had originated in mining operations, been refined through military experience, and were now being adapted for civilian applications ranging from agricultural development to urban reconstruction in post-conflict societies. The presentation included case studies from recent operations where acoustic detection had provided critical intelligence that prevented casualties or enabled access to previously inaccessible areas. Each case demonstrated different aspects of how acoustic techniques could complement conventional approaches while providing capabilities that weren't available through other methods. reinforcing the argument that effective threat detection required multiple complementary approaches rather than dependence on single solutions. The question period following my presentation revealed ongoing challenges in implementing acoustic detection programs, particularly regarding cultural adaptation and institutional acceptance in organizations that remained committed to primarily technological approaches. Several participants shared experiences where acoustic detection had been successful technically but faced resistance from supervisors who questioned the reliability of methods that couldn't be easily quantified or automated. The discussions reinforced lessons I had learned during my own career about the importance of patient persistence in demonstrating the value of unconventional capabilities while building institutional support through documented success rather than theoretical arguments. The most effective advocacy for acoustic detection involved allowing the results to speak for themselves, while providing training and support that enabled others to achieve similar successes in their own operational contexts. The evening reception provided opportunities for informal conversations with participants who shared their experiences implementing acoustic detection in diverse environments and organizational cultures. The conversations revealed common patterns in the challenges and successes that practitioners encountered, regardless of whether they were working with military units, humanitarian organizations, or civilian communities. Dr. Maria Santos, who directed acoustic detection training for the International Committee of the Red Cross, described the evolution of her program from initial skepticism among field personnel to enthusiastic adoption after teams experienced the practical benefits of enhanced detection capabilities. The transformation had required patience, consistent support for learning, and willingness to adapt training methods based on feedback from personnel who were applying techniques in operational environments. The conversation with Dr. Santos highlighted the importance of organizational leadership in supporting innovative approaches that challenged conventional assumptions about appropriate methods and qualifications. Her success in implementing acoustic detection within a traditional humanitarian organization demonstrated that institutional change was possible when leaders were willing to evaluate new approaches based on practical results rather than adherence to established procedures. Captain Elena Vargas, who commanded an explosive ordnance disposal unit for the Spanish military, shared her experience integrating acoustic detection into military operations where speed and technological reliability were traditionally prioritized over methods that required patient observation and interpretation. The integration had been challenging initially, but had proven valuable in situations where conventional detection equipment was inadequate for identifying sophisticated threats. The military applications of acoustic detection required adaptation of techniques that had been developed primarily for humanitarian contexts to operational environments where personnel faced active threats and time constraints that limited opportunities for careful acoustic analysis. The gathering represented a community that had formed around shared commitment to protecting innocent people from threats that conventional security measures often failed to detect. The ceremony included moments of silence for those who had been lost to buried explosive devices in conflicts around the world, recognition of the ongoing work being done to clear contaminated areas and protect vulnerable populations, and celebration of the progress that had been achieved through collaboration between practitioners, institutions, and communities that had embraced acoustic detection as a tool for building safer environments. My closing remarks to the assembly emphasized that acoustic detection represented something larger than a technical capability or professional achievement. It demonstrated that sustainable security required recognizing expertise wherever it existed, supporting individuals who possessed unconventional but valuable knowledge, and creating institutional frameworks that could adapt to new challenges rather than simply applying familiar solutions to unfamiliar problems. The transformation from dismissed medic to recognized expert had required challenging assumptions about who possessed relevant knowledge, and what methods were appropriate for addressing complex security challenges. The success of acoustic detection demonstrated that effective threat identification often required capabilities that existed outside traditional qualification frameworks, but that could be developed and applied systematically when institutions were willing to support innovation, rather than simply defending established procedures. The legacy that would extend beyond my individual career lay in the institutional changes that had made acoustic detection a recognized capability rather than an individual anomaly. The training programs, policy frameworks, and professional networks that supported acoustic detection practitioners ensured that the knowledge would continue to protect people long after I was no longer directly involved in field operations or training activities. The quiet victory that had begun with patient listening during a thunderstorm night in Slovakia had created changes that would continue to save lives in conflicts and post-conflict environments around the world. The most important battles weren't always won through dramatic confrontation, but sometimes through persistent application of knowledge that others had dismissed, combined with the moral courage to trust unconventional expertise when conventional wisdom proved inadequate for protecting innocent people from hidden threats. The afternoon flight back to Switzerland carried me over landscapes where acoustic detection teams were working to clear contaminated areas and provide security for communities that were rebuilding after conflict. From the aircraft window, the world appeared peaceful and orderly, but I knew that beneath the visible surface lay hidden dangers that continued to threaten people whose only protection came from those who had learned to listen carefully to what the earth revealed to those patient enough to hear its warnings. The work would continue in training centers and field operations around the world, carried forward by practitioners who understood that effective security required combining technological capabilities with human expertise that couldn't be replicated by machines. Each new graduate who learned to trust their acoustic instincts represented another layer of protection for communities that faced threats from buried explosive devices and other hidden dangers that conventional detection methods often missed. My grandfather's legacy lived on in every detection that prevented a casualty, every field that was cleared for safe use, every community that reclaimed territory that had been abandoned due to explosive contamination. His understanding that the earth spoke to those who listened carefully had become the foundation for an international capability that continued to protect innocent people from those who would use hidden weapons to create fear and suffering among civilian populations. The transformation from individual skill to institutional capability represented the kind of quiet revolution that changed the world one detection at a time, one training program at a time, one community at a time. The most important victories often happened in silence, achieved by people who refused to accept that conventional wisdom provided adequate protection for those who needed help the most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.